and silence. In the southernmost reaches of the Valley of the Kings, as the sun began to hide in the last folds of the Egyptian desert, a wind blew through the dusty air. No one knew where it had come from, perhaps from the distant borders of Nubia, or from across the Nile, where ancient ghosts whispered in the shade of the ancient acacia trees. But as it passed through here, it carried no life. It carried memory. A whisper. Sand clung to the crevices of the rocks. On the eroded stone, only faint hand-carved lines remained, the shapes of priests, gods, ancient symbols forgotten by the people who had spawned them. But in the midst of it all, there was one name, indistinct, not grand, but stubbornly enduring for more than 3,000 years, Tutankhamun. The name had been a curse, a joke. A young king died alone, rejected by his successors, buried by history. But somehow, as if the stars in the sky would not allow that name to disappear, Tutankhamun returned. Not through his exploits, not through the proud inscriptions on his temples, but through death, and the mystery of death. Today, we call him the Golden Boy King, the most glorious symbol of ancient Egyptian civilization. But behind that resplendent golden mask, behind the name sold on tourist t-shirts and souvenir postcards, lies a strange and chilling story, a story of power, manipulation, religion, death, and life after death. If you dare to enter this valley with me, if you listen to the wind, I will tell you the story of the boy who became immortal. As the last twilight passed over the city of Amarna, the light of the Aten, the only sun god the people were forced to worship, was shining on the roofs of the empty temples. Amarna was unlike any ancient Egyptian city that had ever existed. It was not the image of noble Thebes or ancient Memphis. It was the haunt of a mad king, Akhenaten, who had turned his back on all the old gods and declared that only one existed, the Aten, the divine light of the sun. Into this time of splendor and chaos, a child was born. There was no grand ceremony, no priests chanting his name. Born into a time of doubt and rebellion, the child bore an unexpected destiny. His birth name was Tutankhamun, the living image of the Aten. But destiny was not so easy to unravel. No one knew for sure who Tutankhamun's birth mother was. Some later scholars suggested that he was the son of Akhenaten and one of his sisters, a custom not uncommon among Egyptian royalty, but one that always had dire genetic consequences. The boy had royal blood, but he also showed signs of abnormality from birth. His left ankle was so weak that doctors had to use a wooden support to support it while he was learning to walk. Some papyri recorded frequent headaches and mild epilepsy. But above all, he had eyes unlike anyone else's. The eyes of someone who had seen too much, despite not having lived long. During that time, Akhenaten did not care for his son. He was absorbed in destroying the old gods Ammonius, Osiris, Isis, and building new temples without roofs, so that the sunlight could shine directly down. He abandoned Memphis, abandoned Thebes, and moved the whole court to Amarna, a deserted place, far from everything. Tutankhamun lived in the long shadow of his father, a small child in a palace so large, where no one laughed, no one cried. He was taught to pray every day to the sun disk. He was taught lessons that there was no Ammonius, no underworld, no rebirth, only light and the absolute. In the surviving frescoes, the boy appears as a small figure standing behind Akhenaten, while the pharaoh proudly reaches out to catch the light of the Aten. He was never at the center of anything. But outside the white walls of Amarna, undercurrents were brewing. People whispered about the disappearance of traditional festivals. The priests of Ammonius, once the most powerful class, were banished or killed. Merchants stopped offering sacrifices, and the land began to lose its ancient balance. In the shadows, men like a high-ranking official, and Horemheb, a feared military commander, began to wait. They did not care about the light of the Aten. They waited for an opportunity to restore the old order. One day, the light of Aten went out. Akhenaten died. No one knew why. Some believed he died of illness. Others whispered of assassination or rebellion. Records of his death were almost erased from history, as if the country itself wanted to forget. For a short time, a man named Smenkhare, perhaps Akhenaten's brother or lover, ascended the throne. But his reign was short-lived. Maybe he was murdered. Maybe he never really existed. Everything was as hazy as a dream. And then, in the midst of the crisis, the boy Tutankhamun was called to the throne. A boy not yet 9 years old. A kingdom in ruins. A court without any loyalties. As Tutankhamun stepped onto the stone steps leading into the great hall of the coronation, no one knew what to call him. A living image of Aten? Or was it the remnants of a religious madness? But then a decision changed everything. Under the advice of Ai and Horemheb, the boy changed his name. From Tutankhamun, he became Tutankhamun, the living image of Ammonius. It was more than a name change. It was a declaration of war. The pivot. A sign that the old gods were back. The temple of Ammonius at Thebes was rebuilt. The old priests began to return. The statues of the Aten were torn down. The documents written by Akhenaten were burned or hidden. And in the center of it all, a small boy, wearing a crown too big for his liking, unaware of what was going on around him. Tutankhamun ascended the throne, but the real power was not in his hands. He did not give orders. He did not lead armies. He was only a symbol, a new mask for an old system resurrected. But there was something in his eyes. A gentle light. A part that was not corrupted. Tutankhamun, even as a boy, ordered the restoration of abandoned temples. He allowed people to worship as they wished. And most remarkably, he took a wife, his half-sister Inkhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. They were not a perfect couple, but they were children born in a religious war, and there was, perhaps, a quiet sympathy between them. On the walls of their tombs, the two were often depicted together, not as powerful kings, but as two young people trying to find love in a cruel dynasty. And so, in darkness and light, in intrigue and love, the story of Tutankhamun begins. In the ancient memories of the buried ruins, little remains of Tutankhamun as a child. But from the fragments that remain, statues, pottery, and faded notes, a picture emerges. A picture of a boy living in darkness, with the form of a god, but suffering the pain of a mortal. The Amarna palace that Akhenaten built was too big, too empty. For a small child, the long corridors bathed in the cold light of the desert were not warmth, but a lonely maze. Throughout his childhood, Tutankhamun had no friends, no play. The usual games of ancient Egyptian children, archery, horseback riding, swimming, were out of reach for his frail body. Tutankhamun had a deformity in his left foot. Modern studies have shown that his bones were deformed. His joints were bent abnormally, his toes were uneven. More than 130 walking sticks were buried with him in various burial artifacts, not symbols of power, but essential for daily mobility. He was in pain, and he was silent. His eyes, as if carved into the figurines, did not shine. They were sad, deep, and as if looking at something not of this world. It could have been the fevers, or the sudden seizures, for which the medical science of the time was powerless. While other royal children were taught martial arts and the arts of leadership, Tutankhamun sat in the dark, listening to the new priests preach about the light of the Aten. There were no statues of Ammonius, no legends of Osiris or Isis, only the round sun, casting an invisible light on the pale white walls. There were no traditions, no ancestors, only emptiness and loneliness. The boy grew up under the watchful eyes of more powerful men, with his deep-set eyes and his voice like a whetstone, Horemheb, with his armor and the gaze of a predator. These men did not love Tutankhamun. They watched him as a tool, a thing being nurtured for a further political purpose. And Horemheb both understood. The weaker the boy, the easier it was to manipulate. And they were patient. Only one seemed genuinely concerned, Nkesinamun, his sister and future wife. She was only a few years older, but in her eyes one saw something Tutankhamun never had, understanding. Nkesinamun was also a child born into chaos. Her mother, Nefertiti, had been the most powerful woman in Egypt, then suddenly disappeared from the records. Her father, Akhenaten, was erased from history. Nkesinamun grew up like a flower lost in a storm. And perhaps because of that, she saw in Tutankhamun a mirror of herself. The two children played quietly together in the palace courtyard, under the shade of a twisted sycamore tree worn by the wind and sand. There was no loud laughter. Just glances, a few touches of hands, and afternoons that no one could remember how they ended. And then one day, everything changed. Akhenaten died. Smenkhare disappeared, and Tutankhamun's name was written on a golden tablet for his coronation. He became king without knowing how to hold a sword. He became pharaoh without fully understanding the curse of the throne. But the first thing he was taught was not how to rule, but how to change his name. From Tutankhamun, the man of Aten, he became Tutankhamun, the man of Ammonius. A seemingly simple decision, but a rejection of his father and of the beliefs he had built up throughout his childhood. In a secret ceremony at the temple of Karnak, the priests of Ammonius rechristened the young king. They placed on his head the double crown, symbolizing Upper and Lower Egypt. They cut off the ribbons that bore the sun disk. They lit fires, sang songs, and proclaimed that Ammonius, the ancient god, had returned. Tutankhamun did not understand the full significance of it all. But inside, he must have felt a sense of relief. No more pretending to worship a formless light. No more being forced to kneel before the gaps in the ceiling. He began to hear the old legends again, of Osiris being dismembered, of Isis weeping to the ground, and of Anubis leading souls through the afterlife. Stories of life, death, and love. Under the guidance of and Horemheb, Tutankhamun began to sign decrees to rebuild the temple of Ammonius, to reinstate traditional festivals, to return land to the priests. He did not do it for power. He did it because deep down he wanted normalcy, something to believe in, something other than the cold light on the white walls. But it was then that the darkness began to spread. His body grew weaker. The fevers lasted longer. Every step was painful. The physicians used agave, beeswax, and hornbill ashes, but nothing could cure him. Tutankhamun was growing, but he was also fading. Like a candle burning brightly in a closed room, burning too quickly. Those around him, Horemheb, began to prepare for a future without him. They expanded their influence, conquered lands, formed alliances. He was only a shadow, a child wearing a crown, but not holding any real power. And in the small room inside the palace of Thebes, among the walls painted with forgotten gods, the boy Tutankhamun, now king, sat alone, listening to the wind blowing through the cracks in the door, remembering his childhood, and waiting for something he could not name. The Egyptian throne was more than a thing of wood and gold. It was a symbol, an oath between gods and mortals. But for Tutankhamun, it was a trap, shining, heavy, and weighed down by blood and intrigue. The young king had never known freedom. From birth, he was a tool of forces greater than himself. But it was at the moment of his name change, from Tutankhamun to Tutankhamun, that his destiny became tied to a war to reclaim the soul of Egypt from his father. In the royal court, no one spoke loudly. But the whispers never ceased. The old man with white hair and bony hands, ran everything as an advisor to the king. He had served under Akhenaten, but when the Aten regime fell, I switched sides without hesitation. He knew the tricks of politics, and more importantly, he knew when to keep his mouth shut. And Horemheb, Egypt's most powerful general, who had conquered the north and east, was the embodiment of violence in the name of justice. He cared nothing for the gods. He knew only war, and he craved control. They both knew that the boy Tutankhamun was only a temporary ruler, a fragile bridge between the cursed past and the future they wanted to conquer. Tutankhamun was only 9 years old. The coronation took place in Karnak, surrounded by a sea of white-robed men, priests lighting fires and singing in an ancient language they no longer fully understood. The young king was raised to the throne, his crippled foot hidden under a cloth. His eyes were wide open, not quite sure what was happening. He was given the symbols of power, a scepter and a hook representing shepherd and judge. But both were hollow in his hands. The crowd hailed his new name, Tutankhamun. Ammonius had returned, and with it, the revenge of history. After the ceremony, I sat alone in his chambers, making notes of every expense at court. Horemheb summoned ambassadors from Nubia, Canaan, and other border regions, preparing for the expansion of his power. And the king? He was taken to his chambers, where a slave girl combed his hair and a physician examined the bones of his legs. This was how a dynasty began, not with swords, not with fire, but in silence. During the first year of his reign, Tutankhamun's name was engraved on royal documents, on stone tablets, on pillars. But that was only a formality. Every decree was written under the direct influence of I and the priests of Ammonius. They rebuilt the Luxor temple, restored the idols destroyed by Akhenaten, and held the Opet festivals to win the hearts of the people. For the Egyptians, the return of the old gods was a sign of order. And the young king, with his gentle face and sad eyes, became a symbol of a new beginning. But the throne was still stained with blood. The death of Smenkhkare, the mysterious predecessor, still haunts the court. No one talks about it, but many believe he was murdered to make way for Tutankhamun to ascend the throne. And Nefertiti, Tutankhamun's stepmother and once a powerful queen, also mysteriously disappeared. It is rumored that she tried to ascend the throne under the name Neferneferutin, but failed and was murdered. If so, then the throne that Tutankhamun ascended was the result of a series of secret assassinations. And a boy with a limp became king on the corpses of his own relatives. No one knows what Tutankhamun thought. He spoke little. He painted. He spent time in his room looking at statues of gods. He occasionally played the lyre, a skill that would have been unexpected in a pharaoh. But there were times when servants reported seeing him crying at night, calling for his mother, a woman no one could identify. The price of the throne was not death, it was oblivion. Only Enkhesenamun maintained some humanity in his life. They were married when they were both young. In a simple ceremony held in Thebes, the royal couple stood before a statue of Ammonius and recited their vows. No flowers, no music, just desert sand and the whispers of worn stone statues. It was hoped they would have children, to ensure the continuation of the royal line. But all efforts failed. In the tomb, archaeologists later discovered the remains of 2 fetuses, possibly those of Tutankhamun and Enkhesenamun, who had been miscarried or stillborn. His body was not strong enough. The royal bloodline, through so many generations of inbreeding, had become fragile. And with it, the future of the dynasty had become as fragile as a cicada's wing. Meanwhile, outside forces were growing. Horemheb was waging his repressions in the south. I was consolidating his power in the temples. And Tutankhamun, like a shadow, moved through the rituals, waving his hand at the crowds, signing documents he had not written. But deep down he seemed to know. He knew that the throne he sat on would not last. And one day, blood would be shed again. If Tutankhamun was indeed a king, his kingdom was a stage, where every word was scripted, every action directed by others. From the outside, Tutankhamun's reign appeared peaceful. Temples were rebuilt, religious festivals were held, the Nile flowed in season, and crops were plentiful. But beneath the surface lay a web of power interwoven between ministers, generals, and priests, who silently controlled the country's every breath. The Pharaoh, who was supposed to be the embodiment of Horus, the link between gods and men, was now a frail teenager sitting behind the curtain, listening to others discuss world affairs. Both great powers were in place. I, old, somber, in charge of the administrative and religious apparatus. He presided over all rituals, issued decrees, and controlled the investitures. I was so clever that, despite being a manipulator, he always maintained a loyal, respectful image, never overstepping the mark, at least on the surface. Hormheb, strong, decisive, was the commander of the army and directly controlled the southern and eastern borders. He was the real swordsman of the court, and no one dared to oppose him in the army. But Hormheb was not as patient as I. He wanted the throne, and he was waiting for the first opening. Meanwhile, Tutankhamun began to feel like a showpiece. Every day he had to perform lengthy rituals, offering incense to the gods, wearing different crowns, wearing heavy ceremonial robes, and sitting motionless for hours in the sun to be admired by the people. He tried to study, trying to understand the laws and traditions, but the pages were always turned over before he could put pen to paper. Once he proposed an amnesty for a noble family whose property had been confiscated during Akhenaten's reign. I refused. He wanted to appoint a childhood friend as the head of the local temple. Hormheb objected. Every little decision he made was scrutinized, adjusted, or overturned. Tutankhamun, the only wife he trusted, also became quiet. She avoided court meetings. She stayed in the queen's garden, tending to the bougainvillea garden and the miniature idols. Her grief was like his, deep, thin, and persistent. No children, no power, no freedom. They had only each other, and even that was fragile. Once, when the festival of Opet was held in Thebes, Tutankhamun suddenly asked to lead the procession himself, instead of letting his ministers do it for him. He donned his armor and rode his golden chariot down the Sphinx Avenue in the blazing sun. The crowds cheered. The dancers danced. The priests threw lotus flowers onto the road. It was a rare occasion for Tutankhamun to live like a real king. But before the chariot had gone halfway, his leg began to hurt. The pain was sharp, like needles stabbing through his skin and flesh. He gritted his teeth and held himself straight, not letting anyone know. But as he rounded the last corner, the wheels slipped, and he almost fell. That night he had to stay in bed for 2 days. They never let him ride in a carriage again. There was no denying it, though. Tutankhamun tried to be king. He tried to keep a diary, learn to read hieroglyphs, study the history of previous dynasties. He invited artisans from Nubia, diviners from Syria, and scribes from the Upper Nile, to learn more about the outside world. In his heart, he did not want to be just a shadow. But his body betrayed him. Tutankhamun suffered from frequent headaches, periodic fevers, and a mysterious illness that weakened his immune system. Some modern theories point to malaria, others to Marfan syndrome or the legacy of inbreeding. Whatever the case, his health steadily declined. He had difficulty walking and often needed help. Sometimes he would mumble in his sleep or stare into space as if he saw something that others could not. And then, he began to dream strange things. In his dream, he saw a great stone door in the middle of the desert, covered with sand, but beneath it were footsteps of blood. Each time he approached, a voice spoke, not angry, not gentle, just a whisper. "Who are you without memory?" Tutankhamun woke with a start, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. Enkhsenamun did not dare ask. She just quietly wiped her husband's sweat with a towel, then took his hand, the only time that day he felt like a man, not a king. Meanwhile, the court was preparing for a future without him. I began to promote his nephew to high positions. Horemheb strengthened the army, sent diplomatic messages in the king's name, but with his own signature. And the priests, who prayed daily for the pharaoh's health, began to carve tombstones. No one said it, but everyone knew Tutankhamun's time was running out. But even isolated, controlled, abandoned by his body and time, the young king had one thing that no one could take away: his memories. He remembered his childhood in the cold light of Aten. He remembered Enkhsenamun's small laugh under the shade of the sycamore. He remembered the feeling of riding in a chariot by himself, if only for once. And one night, when his fever had subsided, Tutankhamun called his servants and asked for paper, ink, and the royal seal. He signed a final decree, a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, inscribed with the words, "I am a man of the gods. I have erred, but I have not forgotten." A few weeks later, he fell ill again. This time, he did not wake up. It was a summer day like any other in Thebes. The Nile flowed quietly under the bright sunshine, and the sailboats carrying the scent of lotus flowers and myrrh continued to sail in and out of the harbor. The Karnak temple rang with the steady chants of the priests. But in the gray stone palace outside the city, the quietest place in the kingdom, something was happening. Tutankhamun, the young pharaoh, had not left his chambers for 3 days. Some said he had caught a cold. Others whispered of a return of fever. But only a few were allowed to enter the chamber, and all remained silent. Inside, the sunlight was blocked by thick linen curtains, casting the space in a dark bronze. The smell of medicine, a mixture of crushed herbs, aromatic resins, and acacia bark ash, was a silent prayer. Tutankhamun lay motionless on his black ebony bed, carved with lions' heads at the 4 corners, a symbol of power. But his body was withdrawing from the world. Sweat beaded his forehead, his eyes were half closed, his lips moved wordlessly. His left foot was carefully bandaged, still swollen from a mysterious injury a few weeks earlier. Some said he had fallen off a chariot. Others said the injury was the result of a sudden seizure that had thrown him off balance. Whatever the cause, the consequences were obvious. His body was weak, feverish, and unresponsive to all medicine. Enkhsenamun did not leave the room. Every day, she sat by the bed, wiping the sweat from her husband's forehead with a handkerchief soaked in scented oil. She whispered stories, recounted childhood travels, recited prayers as soft as lullabies. But Tutankhamun no longer responded. Physicians were summoned from all over, one from Lower Egypt carrying a lapis lazuli amulet, one from Kush with a red resin remedy, and an old woman from a village by the river, carrying a box of ashes from the temple of Osiris. None succeeded. All nodded silently and withdrew. One night, as the moon rose, its light quietly filtered through the wooden door, illuminating the statue of Thoth standing guard in the corner of the room. He opened his eyes slowly, for the first time in 2 days. "Enk-is-en," he whispered. Enkhsenamun took his hand, leaned close, her eyes wet with hope. "Number is the wind." Those were the last words. Light as sand, thin as dust, blown away before anyone could understand. And then, there was only silence. Tutankhamun, once hailed as the living man of Ammonius, was dead. At only about 19 years old. No bells. No proclamations. No drums. His death was something the court had prepared for, but still did not dare face when it actually happened. A king dying so young, without an heir, in the midst of an unstable dynasty, was taboo in any civilization. But it was too late. I ordered a blockade. No one was to send news outside the palace. The priests continued their rituals as if the king were still alive. Horemheb, who was commanding the army on the frontier, was sent a brief message, without a reason. A secret meeting of his advisors was called that night. Who would ascend the throne? Who would undertake the funeral? Who would rewrite history? In the meantime, Tutankhamun's body was washed with scented water, wrapped in linen, and placed in a temporary ebony coffin. But death was only the beginning of another race, the race for his soul. Tradition had it that the king should be buried in a grand tomb, with thousands of Ushabti statues to serve him, gold and jewels, and prayers to guide him to the afterlife. But Tutankhamun had died too suddenly. The official tomb was not yet complete. There had been no time to prepare anything. And more importantly, no one wanted to waste time on a king who had no descendants. So I, the loyal advisor who controlled the court, made a decision. Tutankhamun would be temporarily buried in a small tomb, built for a middle-ranking official, deep in the Valley of the Kings. The painters did not have enough time to finish the frescoes. The paint was still wet when the king's body was brought in. The burial objects, statues, masks, utensils, were hastily piled up, without sorting. Some of the personal belongings of other kings were reused, the names scraped off and re-engraved with Tutankhamun's. Even the golden coffin showed signs of tampering, as if it had originally belonged to someone else. No public funeral. No eulogy. No mourning outside the palace. Tutankhamun's death was shrouded in shame by the royal court. In the months that followed, his name was gradually dropped from the official lists. The king's inscriptions skipped from Akhenaten to Horemheb, skipping Smenkhare and Tutankhamun as if they had never existed. The dead could not appeal. And his soul, according to tradition, could not reach the afterlife if it was forgotten. Enkhesenamun, in desperation, sought help. In an unprecedented move, she wrote to the Hittite king, a longtime enemy of Egypt, and asked to marry a Hittite prince to keep the throne. A desperate attempt to protect herself and her husband's legacy. The prince never reached Thebes. On the way, he was assassinated. After that, Enkhesenamun disappeared from all historical records. No one knows what happened to her. Like her husband, was swallowed up by silence. Tutankhamun was buried and forgotten. But in the darkness of his small tomb, hidden among the great dynasties, his spirit still lies there, not complaining, not angry, just silent, waiting to be remembered. The Valley of the Kings, a dry, desolate place where the sun beats down mercilessly and the wind carries away the dust of thousands of years of history, was once the resting place of great pharaohs. Seti I, Ramses II, Thutmose III, all lie in magnificent tombs carved deep into the mountainside, with corridors stretching as if leading to the afterlife. But Tutankhamun, the young king that history wants to forget, did not have that privilege. Amidst the hot stones and the hasty sounds of shovels, a modest tomb coded KV-62 was prepared in silence. There was no long funeral procession, no statues guarding the entrance. In fact, no one was really sure whether this tomb was originally built for Tutankhamun. It was too small, too simple, too unworthy of a pharaoh. The interior walls were hastily painted. The gold was still wet when the carpenters sealed the doors. The figures of Anubis, Isis, and the priests performing the opening of the mouth, a ritual that enabled the soul to speak in the afterlife, looked like copies, lifeless. The sub-basements had not been built. There were no hundreds of meters of corridors like other tombs. Just a rough room, a small corridor, and a funerary storehouse, stacked like the end of the season's goods. And so the king of Egypt, the living son of Ammonius, was placed in a limestone sarcophagus, 3 more coffins inside, and finally a solid gold one that covered the embalmed body. A gold mask was placed over his face, not out of honor, but out of custom. The mask, though magnificent, had not been made specifically for Tutankhamun. Some of the carvings had been altered, the original name had been scratched off and replaced with his own. He was forgotten from the moment he was buried. Around him were the objects, both hurried and splendid, more than 5,000 objects, idols, small boats, walking sticks, golden crossbows, beds, chairs, food, wine, childhood toys, ceremonial costumes. Everything a pharaoh would need in the afterlife, thrown in like a smuggler's cart. There were small monkey statues, symbols of childhood joy. There was a Senate board, a sacred game to help the soul overcome the trials of the underworld. There were golden sandals, made to fit his crippled feet. And there were 2 tiny coffins, 2 unborn fetuses, placed in small wooden boxes beside him. They were believed to be the children of Tutankhamun and Enkhsenamun, who had died before they could take human form. On the last night, when the stone doors were pulled back and the priests covered the entrance with sand, no one thought the tomb would be remembered. KV-62 was a small blip among dozens of larger tombs, located just below the entrance to Ramses VI's tomb. It was soon overshadowed by rubble, dust, and other construction. The weak young king, Tutankhamun, was forgotten, as his survivors wished. Soon after, I ascended the throne. He gave Tutankhamun a small funeral ceremony, not out of grief, but to legitimize his power. A painting in the tomb depicts I performing the opening of the mouth ritual on the pharaoh's corpse, an act usually reserved for relatives or legitimate heirs. Hormheb then usurped I's throne by military force. Once in power, he did the cruelest thing of all. He erased the names of all 3, Akhenaten, Smenkhare, and Tutankhamun, from all royal registers. To him, they were a blemish, an interruption that should not have existed. History was rewritten. The 18th dynasty ended with him. No one knew of Tutankhamun's existence for nearly 3,000 years. His name was not taught in the ancient schools. His tomb was not mentioned. Greek, Roman, and Arab scholars, when they came to Egypt, did not record anything about him. He was erased from human memory like a smudge wiped away. But in the darkness, the small tomb still existed. The stone door was still sealed. The frescoes still held their color. The gold still lay in the darkness. And the spirit of Tutankhamun, rejected, hastily buried, still waited. Centuries have passed since the last stone door of Tutankhamun's tomb was sealed. Kingdoms changed, dynasties rose and fell, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, came one after another, touched the pyramids, rebuilt old temples, or destroyed them to build new ones. But no one knew, or no one remembered, about the boy who once wore a crown too big for his head, lying peacefully in a small tomb on the edge of the Valley of the Kings. Time is the cruelest of gods. It does not destroy, it does not burn, it only waits. Every wind that blows through the valley brings a little more sand. Every rare rain makes a few stones slide down. Gradually, KV-62, the smallest, most makeshift tomb, was buried, hidden under the rubble and unfinished corridors of successive pharaohs. Even those who participated in building the tomb do not remember where it is. Tutankhamun disappeared, not because he was killed, but because no one ever mentioned him again. For more than 3,000 years, tomb raiders scoured the valley. They carried picks, oil lamps, and greed. They pried open the stone doors, broke the seals, plundered the gold and silver and idols, and sold them to the nobles of the West. They dug day and night, like hungry beasts hunting in the dark. But they never found Tutankhamun's tomb. Perhaps it was too small. Perhaps it was too well buried. Or perhaps fate had not intended for it to be excavated. By the end of the 19th century, Egypt had fallen into the hands of the British and French. European archaeologists, partly out of passion, partly out of fame, began the largest excavation campaign ever undertaken in the Valley of the Kings. Names like Flinders Petrie, Theodore Davis, James Quibble were famous in the Western press. They discovered a series of large tombs, but all had been looted since ancient times. And once again, the name Tutankhamun still did not appear. At that moment, a man named Howard Carter appeared. Not a member of the aristocracy. Not formally educated at Oxford or Cambridge. Just the son of an animal painter, with sharp eyes and a strong passion for Egyptian civilization. As a young man, he painted frescoes in ancient temples. As an adult, he became an excavation assistant for Franco-British archaeological teams. But what made Carter different? He did not believe that all had been found. Howard Carter believed that at least one intact tomb had yet to be excavated. And he had a strange hunch that it belonged to a forgotten king, who had lived in a time of chaos, whose name had been erased from the lists. And he knew that if such a tomb existed, it would be buried in the most unexpected places. In 1914, Carter began a full-scale excavation campaign in the Valley of the Kings alone, with funding from the Earl of Carnarvon, a British aristocrat fascinated with Egypt. Year after year, Carter found only rocks, dust, animal bones, and disappointment. By 1922, after nearly a decade of nothing but suspicion, Lord Carnarvon was ready to cut off aid. And then, just weeks after the ultimatum, a workman discovered a stone step buried in the ground near the entrance to Ramses VI's tomb, where no one expected it. They dug down and found a sealed door with the royal seal. The name was engraved on it, Tutankhamun. Carter was stunned. He had dug all over the valley. Everyone thought the place had run out of secrets. But Tutankhamun, the forgotten child, was waiting for him in the simplest place, right at the foot of history. After telegraphing Lord Carnarvon, Carter ordered the stones to be removed one by one, and on November 26, 1922, he placed a candle in the small crack of the newly opened stone door. Someone asked him, "What do you see?" And he answered, in a whisper, full of emotion, "I see the wonderful things." In the flickering light of the candle, there were objects covered in brilliant gold. Thrones, beds, statues of gods, disassembled chariots, chests filled with precious stones. All completely intact, never touched. This was not just an archaeological discovery. This was a whisper of the past, kept secret for more than 3,000 years, now revealed. And the man lying in the middle of it all, in the ageless golden mask, was Tutankhamun. The young king had waited a long time to be found. When Howard Carter opened the first door to the tomb of KV-62, he did more than unearth a treasure. He opened a portal to a forgotten era, touching the fragile skin between the worlds of the living and the dead. In the pale yellow light of the candle, the first chamber appeared unlike any archaeological site he had ever seen. Everything was full, as if time had not penetrated, as if the stone door had kept everything intact in 1,000-year sleep. A golden lion bed, a disassembled chariot, a statue of a god standing guard, black as the deep night. Chests stacked on top of each other, engraved with the name of a man who had been erased from history, Nebkepurur Tutankhamun. Carter walked carefully down the narrow path, barely wide enough to stand. He took meticulous notes, drew every corner of the room, hired a photographer to capture every detail. He understood that every layer of dust here carried within it an entire civilization. The mistake was unforgivable. But Carter also knew something more important. Beyond the second door, an even greater miracle awaited. On February 16, 1923, he and his assistants opened the second door, leading to the main burial chamber. In the small room, the light of an oil lamp illuminated an object lying in the middle of the stone floor, a golden coffin, placed inside a black-painted wooden structure with the figures of gods. 4 layers of coffins, nested inside each other like Russian dolls, the outermost layer of gold-plated wood, the next layer of carved gold, the innermost layer a solid gold coffin, weighing nearly 110 kilograms. When the lid was lifted, everyone held their breath. Inside was a resplendent golden mask, one of the greatest symbols of ancient Egypt, depicting the face of a young boy with an expression of surreal peace. Tutankhamun, after 3,000 years, opened his eyes again, if only through a still gaze. Carter had no particular religion, but he understood the sacred significance of this moment. This was more than a corpse. This was a soul that had been abandoned, now awakened. He halted all activity for 3 days, holding small ceremonies with local priests to appease the dead. But he could not stop what had already begun. For at the same time, another wave of darkness began to rise, not from the tomb, but from the pages of newspapers in England and America. Soon after the news of the discovery spread, the Western media blew up a new story, the curse of the pharaohs. The Times called it the Cursed Cemetery. Other newspapers ran headlines, Death from the Afterlife, The Mask of the Murderer, The Pharaoh's Revenge. The reason? Just a few months after the tomb was opened, Lord Carnarvon, the main sponsor, died. He was bitten by a mosquito, developed an infection, developed a high fever, and died in Cairo. At the same time, the entire city lost power for several minutes, a very rare occurrence. In England, his dog, back home, howled all night and then died at the exact moment he took his last breath. That was enough to create a legend. Some members of the archaeological team also suffered. A photography assistant died of blood poisoning, an American engineer was in a car accident, a French aristocrat who came to see the treasure committed suicide a few weeks later. The world began to believe the tomb was cursed, that Tutankhamun, forgotten, exploited, hastily buried, still retained some sacred power, enough to punish those who disturbed his sleep. Carter did not believe it. I lived another 17 years after the excavation, he said. If there was a curse, I would have died first. But he did not deny the strangeness of the place. He said that one night he heard footsteps around the camp. Another time, the idols in the gallery were turned around even though no one was there. The local workers refused to continue working without a purification ceremony. There is something here, said one old man. It does not want to be awakened. Carter did not back down. He continued his work, arranging each artifact, making detailed lists, sending some of them back to Cairo for public display. More and more people came to know Tutankhamun, the name once buried and now a symbol of the entire Nile civilization. No one expected that the man who did little in life would be the most famous in death. His short death, his obscure reign, his frail body, none of it seemed important. What mattered was his silence, kept intact, revealed at the exact moment the world needed a myth. Tutankhamun had waited more than 3,000 years to be heard, and now millions flocked to Cairo to see his mask, bowing respectfully before the remains of a frail teenager who had once been forgotten. In this strange immortality, Tutankhamun had finally become a god, not because of victory, but because his long silence had become sacred. When Howard Carter first laid eyes on the golden mask of Tutankhamun, he could not have imagined that he was standing before an icon that would change the way the world viewed ancient Egypt. And no one expected that a king rarely mentioned in official records, died young, reigned briefly, had no achievements, left no descendants, would become the most famous pharaoh in history. Throughout the 20th century, Tutankhamun's name spread across the globe, starting with articles published in major newspapers from England, America, France, Germany. Then came the bustling exhibitions in London, Paris, Tokyo, New York, where millions of people lined up just to see with their own eyes the golden mask, the golden sandals, or the toys of a child who had been dead for more than 3,000 years. No one expected that the boy, who had been buried by the entire court, would become the most vivid ambassador of Egyptian civilization. Scholars flocked to study him. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo dedicated a whole wing to Tutankhamun's treasures. Historians rewrote the entire 18th dynasty, tracing the lines thought lost, from Akhenaten to Enkhesenamun. Tutankhamun's name, once erased from stone, was now engraved on millions of books, stamps, postcards, commemorative coins, and even jewelry. He was immortal, not in the world of the gods, but in the world of modern humans. In 2005, Egyptian scientists conducted the first CT scan of Tutankhamun's remains. The scans revealed signs of a fractured left femur, skull damage, leg deformities, and possibly a serious genetic disease. Some theorized that he was murdered. Others suggested that he died from an infection in the fracture or from malaria transmitted by mosquitoes. DNA analysis even shows that Tutankhamun's parents were brothers, which would explain the many serious health problems he suffered from. And in the cold basement room of the Egyptian Museum, where Tutankhamun's real remains are preserved, one finds a small, shrunken body with malformed feet and a thin face. Not like the ideal image on the mask. Not like any royal image. Just a boy, lived too fast, died too soon, and was thrust into a world not meant for children. And perhaps that is what makes Tutankhamun more relevant to modern humanity than any other Egyptian king. He was not a great man. He did not fight. No monumental works bear his name. No laws were written by him. He did not even choose his own fate. But it was precisely this vulnerability, this tragedy, that made him the most authentic Egyptian. For he represents what everyone fears: to be forgotten, to be used, to be buried without a word of remembrance. And when his treasures, the golden mask, the walking stick, the leather sandals, the unsent love letters, were brought to light, the world seemed to say, "We miss you." Tutankhamun was not dead. He was just waiting to be called. And now, as millions of people each year pause before that mask, silently gazing into those motionless golden eyes, he is alive again, in memory, in belief, in doubt, and in dreams of ancient Egypt. The desert at night is strangely silent. The wind blows through the cliffs engraved with the names of ancient pharaohs, swirling up the tiny grains of sand that once touched the feet of the gods. The moon shines on the Valley of the Kings, like the slender fingers of time knocking on each sealed door. In the deepest place, under the earth and rock, where there are no lights, no human voices, there is a small room that still lies, like a breath suspended between two worlds. That room was once a place of oblivion. Now it has become a legend. If you walk through that valley, stop for a long time, and listen to the wind, you might hear a whisper, not in human voices, not in writing, but in memories. A memory engraved in gold, in sand, in unfulfilled dreams. A reminder that no one is truly dead if someone remembers them. And he, Tutankhamun, is the immortal proof of that.